But yeah, because I think there are some good things to say there.
Yeah.
That
But
we
it
can
might be
talk.
the case that I'll ask you some questions based on what you're saying as well.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
I mean, ideally, this would be like a podcast, like Joe Rogan type format, where it's just like sitting down and having a casual
A
conversation.
conversation, yeah.
But with objectivism, it's like there's a sense in which people are a little bit like trying to be within the lines of like, oh, I don't want to get this point across like slightly, not what exactly what I meant, because it might be misinterpreted. So people are always a little bit on the edge on some of these things, especially controversial topics, which we're not going to get in today. But
Right.
uh, did a person really meant that, or is that
But I think Alex Epstein's a good model on that because
right?
he goes on a variety of formats.
Yeah,
Sometimes he only has 4 minutes, sometimes it's 2 hours, and sometimes it's people that know how to interview, and sometimes it isn't. And
yeah,
I think there's just a skill to navigating and dealing with what's there.
yeah,
And I think people understand more now that with there's so much content out there. I don't think I mean, from my perspective, I don't think it's quite as sensitive as if you were putting something together, I don't know, 20 years ago or something, where there's just so little being produced and you want everything to be just right. I don't know. I think people are desensitized a little bit.
yeah, yeah. Hopefully, this will improve in the coming years. I'm pretty sure that you're always on camera. So even if I'm speaking, uh, so just it's an issue to be aware of.
Yeah. Okay.
You don't want to pick your nose when I'm speaking, right? Just as a
Right, right. Or I'll sit there and go,
I'm not speaking or dying.
yeah.
Jeez. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Ricardo, uh, I think it's almost 7. You can start the introduction. Some people are entering right now, so you can keep up uh, with the interview, and everything is going to be recorded. So if people miss it, no problem.
Okay. I was waiting for the clock to turn to 7, which is in 10 seconds. So that's just the thing I was waiting. But yeah, we can start. Just give it a second. Ok. Então, bem-vindo a todos. Este é um novo programa que nós estamos começando aqui no Objetivismo Brasil. Parte do nosso propósito é trazer pessoas intelectuais e pessoas dentro do objetivismo, tanto alunos quanto pessoas que já praticam, que já escrevem livros, que já são intelectuais ativos no movimento, para eles poderem contar um pouco da experiência que eles têm dentro do objetivismo e poder compartilhar um pouco disso conosco e poder ter essas discussões mais próximas aqui dentro do contexto brasileiro. Então, a primeira pessoa que nós trouxemos é o Mark Moses, que é um aluno do OAC, do curso do Ayn Rand Institute, dos Estados Unidos. E a conversa, ela será em inglês, mas todos que quiserem ouvir em português podem selecionar a opção do Globo na plataforma do Cisco para ouvir a tradução simultânea. E para quem estiver depois ouvindo no YouTube, nós teremos o link também para a gravação em português. So, welcome, Mark. It's good to have
Thank you,
you.
Ricardo.
So just as a brief introduction, so this is a new format, a new program we are starting at Objectivism Brazil. And our purpose is to bring intellectuals within Objectivism to discuss both their experiences as objectivists, how Objectivism influenced their lives, and their professional career, so the things they've done because of Objectivism. Today's conversation is with Mark Moses, who is an OAC student and has been a long time objectivist. And we'll be talking more so on his personal experiences, personal and professional, experiences with objectivism. So the first question I would like to ask you is, when was your first contact with Rand's ideas, and what did you do to keep exploring her ideas initially?
Yeah, well, I was in my mid-teens, and my father, who's a school teacher and always had a lot of books around the house, began reading Ayn Rand and talking about some of the reading. And I think I might have paged through some of the nonfiction, maybe read a chapter here and there, and had initially a positive impression about just the clarity of the writing. And when I was about 16, I sat down and read Atlas Shrugged. And it was, at the time, the longest nonfiction book I'd ever read. And I read it with intensity. It was like, I wish I had the mental stamina to have read it straight through and experienced it straight through. It was like every time I had to stop, I couldn't wait to jump back in. So it had a profound, and every time I go back and read it, it's the same thing of, wow, this is just an incredible experience going through this work of fiction. And so from there, I uh, started reading the nonfiction works, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, Virtue of Selflessness, The New Left, Anti-Industrial Revolution, and basically consumed everything I could, well, that my dad had purchased. And there was even more coming into the house because he subscribed to the Ayn Rand letter. So this is in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. And so there was fresh things coming out from Ayn Rand at the time. And so during my senior year of high school, I took Dr. Peikoff's logic course, which was offered on tape uh, at various places across, I think at the time it was mainly US and Canada, maybe a few other places worldwide. And so it was offered on the Stanford University campus on Friday nights. Uh, my dad drove me down and I attended the course. And the next year, the Philosophy of Objectivism course came out. Dr. Peikoff actually came out to San Francisco in February of 1977 to deliver the first lecture live. And so that was a really big deal at the time because it seemed like nobody from, Objectivism, the prominent intellectuals came to the West Coast. They were all back in New York. And so
Right.
that was a big deal. Um, and then participated in the rest of the course through the tape series. And that was the one where Ayn Rand participated in the question and answer period. So I was hearing those, 6 or 7 months after they took place live in New York. So by the time I graduated from Berkeley in 1981, I had pretty much consumed, I won't say everything, but I'd say most of what was out there at the time. And it's kind of interesting looking back on that to think that you could have consumed all of, mostly all of Objectivism and what was written and out there. But that was really the body of work. And so I was an engineering major. I gonna, wasn't really attracted to the humanities and being a philosophy major and going that route and going into academia. So I I guess I would say my exploration kind of plateaued or stalled a bit in the early 80s uh, because there wasn't a whole lot of stimulation and more material coming out. I'll say in retrospect, I really could have used Understanding Objectivism, which didn't come out until several years later, or OPAR, which would have been helpful guide. And then and even like some of Gene Moroney's courses that didn't come out till decades later. Looking back, I really could have used that. So I would just describe it as I went all in. I consumed as much as I could, tried to understand it the best I could, and then and somewhat plateaued there in my 20s there.
Yeah. So, what do you think? What do you think were some of the differences between studying objectivism as a system of thought before OPAR had come out? So, as you said, you were consuming all kinds of content that was coming out still at the time. It was fresh. So, in the 70s, objectivism was still there was still new stuff being produced because Ayn Rand was still alive and writing. So what do you think was the difference before OPAR, which I think was published in 91 or 92, and then after?
Yeah, well, I mean, well, first of all, I think the understanding objectivism, I think, was huge because really taking it to a deeper level. I mean, when I look back, I'll say that, yeah, at age, 19, 20, 21, I understood a lot, but a lot of it was floating. And I think it was floating for two reasons. I think it was floating partly because uh, being able to concretize some of the principles just and relate it to life experience when you don't have a lot of life experience is tough. And the and there's a lot of subtlety. You start to appreciate how revolutionary it really is when you dig in and really try to understand what's going on. It's kind of interesting. The standard thing you hear is, "Oh, I read Ayn Rand when I was young, and then I grew out of it." And I, my story is the complete opposite. It's like I read Ayn Rand when I was young, and I was really taken by the clarity and by the insights. And the more I've dug into it after 4 decades more of life experience, the more I appreciate it, the deeper I think it is, and the the richer and more things I can see in it. So OPAR brought everything together systematically and in one place. And before that existed, it was just it was just a different time in terms of trying to conceptualize objectivism as a whole, even with the philosophy of objectivism and understanding objectivism, the reference material really put it all together. And then, once you have the internet and podcasts and the latest generation, with the OAC, I guess now Ayn Rand University, um, it's just now you have a whole different kind of problem or challenge. It's like, okay, there's so much out here. How do I approach it? How do I prioritize? How do I learn it? Um, and so but I think there's a huge advantage in having so many different teachers and ways of communicating because I mean, Dr. Peikoff is a genius in terms of his teaching and is incredible, but the material is so deep and there's so many layers and there's so many issues with applying it that it's great to have people with different kind of presentation styles, different kind of backgrounds, using the material and applying it and modeling it.
Yeah. And I wonder, Harry Binswanger's lexicon, was that something that also had an impact? Because you can more easily reference things, like if you have a
Oh,
question.
that's an incredible, yeah. So I would say that's another one where that's another kind of milestone. Yeah, it changes things. By the way, since you mentioned Harry Binswanger, he did come out and delivered a philosophy course on the of all places on the University of California, Berkeley campus. He was sponsored by one of the professors there. This was in 1984, and when I heard he was coming and would be delivering this course, I made sure to sign up as an auditor just because it was a rare opportunity uh, to see an objectivist intellectual in a live setting. Remember, this is long before OCONs, and
Yeah.
there were just, I mean, you had to live in New York to be close to the live activity.
Yeah. And I mean, at the time, there was no online streaming. So, I mean,
No,
it's interesting that you had growing up in the US, you had, let's say, this difficulty of meeting an objectivist intellectual, because at the time they were so rare, and speaking events were so rare. So either you had to travel to a place, or they happened to go to the city you live in. And now with the internet, it's a very different atmosphere. I mean, I brought up the lexicon. I mean, I only know the lexicon as the online version. I've never seen the book, and it might take a few more years for me to see the book, or even to have it, or even if I have the book physically, it would be more like, I have it to say I have it, but I would only consult the online version, due to the
Right.
practicality of, just type in the word and you get it directly. So it's, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, and I think that was a real turning point. I mean, it took a little while for the content to really filter out as the internet grew, but certainly by 2010, there was already starting to become an accumulation of material, and when ARI started putting things out on YouTube and started to get content out, which these last 4 years have just been a real explosion of new material that's being put out. It's it's a whole different world.
Yeah. So let me ask you, can you give some concrete examples of how objectivism influenced your either professional or personal life?
Yeah, so well, in terms of professional life, uh, and after college, I went into consulting small businesses uh, and real estate investment type field and banking. Like the first decade I was out of college, so it I wouldn't say it was quite a real influence on career choice as such, as much as just kind of reinforcing what I had kind of naturally anyway. I wanted to be productive. I wanted to get out in the world and do things, and so I would say the main influence was maybe how when I did get out, I observed things. It was somewhat of a filter through which I observed things. I mean, one thing was noticeable, uh, just how non-philosophical people are, who, I mean, even
Yeah.
really smart people, just not really aware of like like how they pick up ideas and what they embrace and the contradictions. And I think from that point of view, it was good to have objectivism in terms of having a certain kind of confidence of how to hold these things, but it was challenging because just the volume of that you run into in the world is substantial. Um, and so, in private industry, you just see a lot of things just driven by pragmatism, and again, no systems, no integration, um, yeah, a lot of short-term pragmatism. And then when I entered the public sector, um, it was uh, it was to the extreme because then it was this I would say openly in objectivist terms primacy of consciousness based pragmatism because it was oh, it's just about political perception. The reality doesn't matter. It's all about message and positioning and and the image you put out there. And it's like and there's no reference to reality. It's not even some kind of crazy attempt to go back and tie it together or even think that you need to because that's the world you live in. And so it's and I think and this is where I really could have used understanding objectivism and some of the other
Yeah.
resources to really help sort through that, maybe better at the time, because it because there's a lot to contend with out there in terms of just how things just go so astray intellectually and culturally.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, one of the main advantages I remember from listening to Understanding Objectivism is having a much better grasp of how your own thoughts can go wrong, like your thinking method can go wrong. And so if you have a better understanding of the limited number of thinking methods that exist, when you're talking to people, it's a lot easier to understand like where they're coming from. And then you realize like the kinds of premises that they have and the kinds of conclusions that they end up having. You know, so I mean, I can only imagine the horror of working in the public sector and people having like, as you described, this primacy of consciousness, pragmatism. You know.
And explicitly, because yeah, and you'd hear people say it's just all about perception. Don't worry about it. It's just all about perception.
Yeah.
So, and then personally, um, I mean, well, I'll just say I didn't really have a fantasy of marrying an objectivist, or maybe I did for 10 minutes, but I mean, back in those days, uh, the I mean, when I was at these tape lectures, uh, I was always I was always the youngest one in the room by at least 5 years, and and I would say, and this is generalizing to a quite extent, but the profile of the people that were attending, I mean, it was mostly male and a lot of like engineering, hard sciences, computer programming. I mean, that was kind of the sweet spot of the profile, and there were certainly exceptions, but in terms of just a general demographic of kind of who was interested, who was involved, who was attending the tape lectures, um, I mean those are the people I was meeting, and again there
Yeah.
was no con, and so in terms of my relationships and getting married, I was looking for kind of the shared secular values and compatibility and looking for somebody who brings out the best in me and
Yeah.
type thing and like with raising kids I had a little bit of a model for that because my father was a school teacher and he was interested in early childhood education and so he was experimenting with me and my brothers so I was brought up in an atmosphere that valued education uh, but I think the twist that objectivism gave was just the value of independent thinking, respecting the child's mind, and that was one thing that was said to me that I never, or I hope I never told my kids was when they asked why, because I said so. It was just something I heard growing up, but I saw that as really not respecting the kids' minds and missing an opportunity to model
Right.
clear thinking and reasons for actions. And raising kids is, and this is more learning from experience there is more about leading them. And and you go in with certain expectations of how you're going to raise your child, but I learned to be realistic about the how much influence you can have. I mean, sometimes you can underestimate the influence and not realize what they're paying attention to. But on the other hand, I mean, I had one of our boys struggled with reading, and it seemed like no matter how much time I put into it or effort or approaches, he really struggled. And the other one taught himself to read because he wanted to read some of the instructions on his gaming system. And the so I think you have to go into it with certainly a serious um, intent of setting up the best environment for them, but again being realistic that they've got their own temperaments and capacities and motivations and they're going to make their own decisions.
Yeah. It really seems it boils down to, when you're talking about a partner, a romantic partner, it really seems to boil down to the person being rational. So you don't necessarily want bullet points like, oh, okay, you read Atlas Shrugged, check. You agree with the virtue of selfishness, check. That seems I can see people having that kind of approach, like, because yeah, again, it goes back to understanding objectivism, right? The course, which is
Mhm.
there's a lot of let's say there's a lot of rationalist transposition from people people are used to be Christians, they drop that, now they become objectivists, but they still have the framework, right? All that those underlying premises. So I can see someone coming up with a checklist, elaborate checklist on the person's morality, creating a score or something like that. And it's the same with raising children. I mean, there's no guide, especially not in objectivism. There's no, guide as to how do you teach them morality or how do you teach them virtues and so on. It's a lot more using your mind, and you learn on the job, both with the romantic partnership and with the raising kids.
Certainly.
So today, I mean, you are, you started learning about objectivism when you were like, a teenager, and all these years later, you decide to dive deep into objectivism again and join the OAC as an auditor. So now you're in the year 3 of the course, which is the last year. So why did you decide to study in the OAC, and what has been your experience so far?
Well, and then just to kind of close the gap, because it wasn't a completely Rip Van Winkle kind of thing. You know who Rip Van Winkle is?
Oh no.
So it wasn't like I totally dropped out for decades. I kept some kind of tie over the years where like when big things came out, like when the Ominous Parallels came out, I bought that right away and read it.
Yeah.
And when How We Know came out, I went and read that right away. So there were certainly things that came out over the years that were just like so big and so monumental in terms of on my radar and things that I was really engaged in and wanted to see that I did read those books. And the and I think I went to Ocon was actually in within an hour drive of my house, I think back in the early 2000s. And I broke away for a day and attended a day session. So I kept some, kind of connection.
Contact, yeah.
But really the latest turn in the deep dive, part of it was a setup of, okay, my kids are grown. I'm able to, take a little more control of my time. And then by 2018, I was spending, time on my book writing project, and the project entailed applying principles of objectivism, as best I understand them, to my experience in local government. And I was highly motivated to explore objectivism more deeply, to make sure some of it was a refresh and some of it was understanding at a deeper level, to improve my thinking, writing, and communication skills. So I think that was the first OCON I attended, um, the full week.
Right.
And that's where I heard how they were beginning to admit auditors to the OAC program.
Right.
And so a few months later, I met Tal Stefani at a social gathering in Northern California, and he was raving about how much fun it was to participate in the OAC as an auditor. And and so there, I had these considerations about the time commitment and everything, but I thought, oh man, if Tal can take this on 6 months or 8 months after he took over the Ayn Rand Institute, then I'm sure I can find a way to fit all this in. So I signed up for the OAC the following year, and I'll just say it's exceeded my high expectations in terms of uh, what I wanted to get out of it. I mean, on multiple levels. It's in the year one, it pushed me to go back and read some things that I literally had not read in 40 years, and see them with that additional experience level and perspective. Uh, and then the quality of the instruction is just tremendous. Ben, Aaron, Nikos, all of them just really, really great minds and rich. And I like hearing the students and the other auditors with their question. And I mean, the only thing that would make it more fun is if it were in a physical classroom and we could really be together.
Right.
But having access and people being able to attend from all over the world is tremendous. So and since I'm not a graded student, I don't get direct feedback, but I compensate by that by using the office hours from time to time to have some direct conversation with the instructors. So it's yeah, and I look forward to auditing more courses in the future, just because I want to keep it up, and it's really helped again sharpen my thinking. Just to concretize that a little bit, because one of the things I wanted to get out of, or want to get out of this third year here is, I knew enough to sense sometimes that a given argument is off base, but really being able to get underneath it and say, well, what is that argument? Where is it coming from epistemologically or metaphysically? What's really behind it? And that's something that I'm more motivated to pursue. And it's something that working with the material in the OAC coursework has really helped me, where I feel like my ability to do that, to dissect these things and say, oh, that's the argument, that's where it's coming from, that's what's behind it, is improving. Because that was one thing that always amazed me about how Ayn Rand or Leonard Peikoff or Harry Binswanger would answer a question. They would answer it so comprehensively, and you could just see it working. Like they would say, "Oh, you're asking that question because of this behind it," and so they could model it, but being able to do that, or do that on the spot, is a real skill.
Yeah. I mean, there's a sense in which, especially in the year one of the OAC, where we have the seminar on objectivism, there's a sense in which we learn how to think. That was definitely my experience. There were layers of thinking I wasn't aware someone could do. And it goes into this kind of analysis you're talking about, where you read a paragraph and you go, oh, I see where they're coming from. This is their argument. This is the person's premises, and this is where it will lead. And it's just so useful to have that kind of like tool in your thinking box, you know, and it's applicable to anything, right? So it's not a philosophy exclusive kind of thing where I can only apply this when reading philosophy, right? But rather I can apply it in anything that I'm doing in my life, because I mean, after all, we're talking to other people, and people have their philosophical premises. Even though more often than not, they're not really aware of them. So, I mean, recently you wrote or finished writing and published a book. So, how did objectivism, so the philosophy of objectivism, and perhaps even objectivist intellectuals, influence your decision to write a book?
Yeah, well, I guess the seed was planted for the book about 14 years ago, when a friend of mine, Jeff Britting, who's also the archivist for the Ayn Rand Institute, he was the first archivist back in the 80s. And I guess since they're digitizing things, he'll probably leave as the only analog archivist for ARI. I've known him since we overlapped at UC Berkeley back in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was a philosophy major there. And at the time, there were 30,000 students or so on campus. We were the only two who were taking Dr. Peikoff's courses at the time. And so over the tape presentations. So and he's one of the ones who would help like keep me informed on what's going on with ARI or what's going on with objectivism and things. So because we would keep up over the years. So we were having dinner in LA, and I was telling him about some of my experiences in management, finance positions in local government. And he said, "You should write a book." And I I didn't quite get where he was coming from. It made no sense to me. Like that, but he had this vision of, wait, you've got this philosophic background uh, um, and insight. You've got all these years of experience. You can apply this, and it would be unique and great. And so I think after that, I sent him an email with some ideas of topics and things, and he sent back something really positive and encouraging, like, yeah, these are all great, food for subject matter. And so, but I still really didn't get the power of his vision of what this could be. But it planted the seed. And then about 6 years later, uh, I was reading Alex Epstein's Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and that's where it really set in. That's where it's like, oh, okay, here's how somebody well versed in the principles can take them and apply them to a real world subject. And he did it so masterfully and so in such an engaged way. It literally went through my head that, oh wow, somebody has to do this with local government policy, and I'm going to be really upset if it's not me, because I know it will be done someday. Somebody has to do it. And and he set such a good example. It was just so inspiring. That's where I really turned the corner and said, okay, I'm going to organize around writing this book. And then another thing shortly after that I saw that was kind of interesting was there was a 2016 Ocon presentation called "How Books Propel a Philosophic Movement," and
Right.
that had Jerome Brook, Ilan Journo, Steve Simpson, and Don Watkins. And I didn't attend in 2016, so I probably saw that maybe a year and a half after it was presented live. But that just furthered the inspiration of, oh yeah, books are important. Putting a book out there is worth the effort. And so all of that was really what led up to my organizing my life and time around writing. And then it had, but part of the motivation I just want to point out is working in local government. I often saw my values trampled on, disparaged. And here I thought, oh, here's a real opportunity. This book can be a vehicle to convert some of the frustration into something positive. And so it's not meant to be just a rant about, all these bad experiences. It's meant to be drawing on the experiences and putting something out there that is um, a positive solution and a positive approach to solving what a lot of people are rightfully frustrated with, but don't necessarily know how to articulate it or focus their frustration. And so it really, one of the reasons I'm excited about it is it's really a unique kind of new genre, if you will, of people trying, taking objectivist principles, applying them to an area outside of uh, philosophy, to these events and things, subject matter that's out there. And I mean,
Yeah.
what's really
Uh,
out there like that? The moral case for fossil fuels. Jonathan Hoenig wrote Price is Primary, where he applies objectivist principles to investments. But it's it's an emerging area that is really fun to be a part of, and I'm really interested in taking it as far as I can take it.
Yeah, I also imagine that the books that Yaron Brook wrote with Don Watkins had an impact, right? These came out in the 2010s, let's say. So I know you know Don a little bit. So what impact did Don have, and how did
Yeah,
he
well, this
contribute?
was, if you had asked me in 2016, who would be your number one person to team up with to help you write the book, I would have said Don Watkins in a flash. Um, because just his reputation with I liked his podcast and what I heard on that when he was doing a podcast for ARI, and with the books that he co-wrote, yeah, with Yaron, it was clear he was really a masterful part of that writing and production of those books, and then his work with Alex Epstein as well after Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Well, I think during and after Moral Case for Fossil Fuels was came out. It was like, what better way to get insight to how Alex approached all that than to work with somebody who's been working directly with Alex? So yeah, he would have been number one on any kind of list of people to work with. And so when the pandemic hit and the lockdown of spring of 2020, two big things happened. One is I immediately pivoted, and I was getting some pretty good momentum going with the writing in terms of allocating a fair amount of time. But now it was like there's no distractions, there's nothing else to do, can't go out. So I just poured everything into the writing, and because the lockdown was disruptive to some of the activities that Don was supporting, he was available for consulting. So in the summer of 2020, he had agreed to take me on as a client and kind of be my writing communications coach, for which lasted pretty much through the end of 2020 and bled over a little bit into 2021. So he was he was key in helping me with my proposal to my publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, and was I just can't say enough about how much I learned from one-on-one sessions with him, and how helpful he was with pointers, because who else are you going to go to for help on communicating ideas about liberty and applying these principles to to real life stuff that's out there? So that was really one of the exciting highlights. And then Jeff Britting circled back at the end and was helpful in some of the later editing review, because once I got the publisher, I felt like, oh, now I really have to do this justice. I've got this big platform. I really want to get it right. And so it was a big last push to, again, as a first-time author with no track record, really trying to make the book the best it could be.
Yeah, so out of curiosity, did you have the book finished by the time you audited the communications course with
No, and that was really a tough time, because I was when that course was going on, I was working on my uh, my proposal to the publisher, which consisted of 10 chapter summaries and one uh, sample chapter, one full sample chapter. So I was working on that. I was meeting with Don over Zoom, an hour, hour and a half, once a week. And so I was getting feedback from him and help from him. And then I was in the communications course with Keith, and I'm trying to absorb as much and learn as much from that as possible. And so, uh, and so it was really an intense time in terms of how much I was trying to produce in terms of writing, and also understand and incorporate into my writing. And it was one part of it was really horrific. When I would go back and read some of the things I wrote earlier, I'd be like, oh no, it's like, and just to give you an example, Don would say, okay, you need to have these transitions smooth. It's just like every paragraph has to emerge from the previous paragraph and set up the next one. And I'd go back and read some of what I'd written, and I'm like, I don't even know why I wrote this or why this is here. And it's like, and if I can't figure it out,
yeah.
what chance does the reader have? And so it's a real interesting experience when you take this on. And you have to remember, my writing was over professionally was writing staff reports, and the staff reports were very disposable. You know, they might be 6 pages or 8 pages, and then that was it. Then the next meeting would come and another staff report. And so writing a 200-page book is not like writing 10, 20-page staff reports. It's a whole different type of challenge. And so it was, it gave me a real appreciation of how much motivation it takes to write a book, and also how much skill is involved in writing well. And I think we learned that too in the communications course, that you can be really, really smart or really, really verbal in terms of your communication skills,
Yeah.
and not necessarily write good stuff. And how you see how you're able to untangle things that do get tangled is just a learned skill.
Yeah, and I think this goes for everything that we're doing like the first time, right? Where we're usually not fully aware of the rework that is required,
Yeah,
right? Like writing a book is like, well, it's like 200 pages. All right, I can write 200 pages.
yeah,
But if you want to write a really good book, you really got to write maybe 1,000 pages, because you're writing like those 200 pages like a few times, right?
yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, the whole thing about writing is editing. You really learn that. I mean, yeah, because I had this idea. It's like, oh, I know this material so well. It's all in my subconscious. I'll just sit down and just crank it out, like, and no, it's not. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask you the last question. So you are a little bit older than I am, and you had the privilege of once meeting Ayn Rand. So could you tell that story? How did that go?
Sure. Well, it was spring of 1981, April 1981, Ford Hall Forum in Boston. And I was 21. I think I was a couple months away from turning 22. And it was my first trip to the East Coast. And so there were, always a few of us there's always some small group from Northern California that was there, and it kind of changed from year to year. But there was a group of us that planned around it and made it over there. And so the evening before the talk, there was a reception at one of the hotels for the lessees who administered the objectivist courses. Again, this is back in the reel-to-reel tape days. And so, and again, it was mostly, I think, US and Canada were where most of these courses, and certainly a lot of the people who came to Boston were from. And so I tagged along as kind of a plus one guest of one of the Northern California lessees who's like, oh, yeah, yeah, come along, come along. And I'm like, oh, okay. And we assumed that Leonard Peikoff would be there, but there were no other expectations. And then suddenly there's a big commotion in one of the corners of the room. And of course, the word quickly spread, oh, Ayn Rand is here. She'd like to meet everyone. So just kind of, make your way into a reception line of sorts, or she's going to kind of make her way around. And I remember there was this Canadian guy who's, I think he might have been in high school. He's probably a couple years younger than I was. And he immediately like raced back to his hotel to get his copy of Atlas Shrugged to get signed. And but I didn't have any copies of my books in my hotel, uh, and I don't think I wanted to risk that Boston traffic to run back and forth. I just
Right.
figured, okay, I just want to kind of take this in. This is really an unexpected, neat kind of thing. So so I was in front of her for about 30 seconds maybe, and I guess in terms of what really stuck with me is she really looked like she was having a great time. I remember in those days there weren't a lot of big events. I mean, there was Fort Hall Forum once a year, and I know she had been doing some of the Q&As for some of Dr. Peikoff's courses, and so was interacting with a few people, uh, but I figured she didn't get the opportunity to meet a lot of people students of Objectivism outside of the New York area, and she really looked like she was like having a great time. She was very warm, attentive, and I would say very present. It's like she's wasn't very tall, but she had a lot of presence, and you kind of saw that when you see her on stage at the Ford Forum, and so it was really neat just to have a little taste of that personal interaction, and 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 I probably didn't even appreciate it that much at the time, but and I mean, it wasn't that long after that she passed, and so looking back, yeah, that really was unique to be able to just
Yeah.
even be at a Ford Hall Forum live and in the same room with her that way, let alone in a
Which talk
reception.
was it?
It was, I believe it was the Age of Mediocrity.
Okay. Is that the last one she did?
It wasn't her last live talk, but I think it was her last Ford Hall Forum.
Yeah,
Because
yeah,
I think Dr. Peikoff wound up delivering the next one
yeah.
after her death because but her last talk I think was later that year. That was the one where um, she took a train to New Orleans and did with that
Yeah.
sanction of the victim maybe.
I
Uh,
think so.
yeah,
Yeah, I know what talk you're talking. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, but it was a Ford Hall Forum. That was the last one, the one you attended.
right, right.
Yeah, and so what was I mean, she died. I mean, you said this is April of 81. She died, I mean, less than a year later, I think.
Right. I think,
What
yeah.
was how did you learn about her death? And I mean, uh, what was your reaction?
Um, I can't remember who told me. Yeah, it's hard to remember how how you got information before you would see it flash on your phone. But I think it was a friend who called, who had gotten the word, and uh, and then somehow I think some newspaper clippings and things got passed around. But um, it's I'll have to think about that because I mean I don't even know how we drove around and found friends' houses the first time before we had GPS or any of that stuff in the 80s or gotten contacted with people. But no, but the word got around, among those of us that were keeping in contact and talking with each other, and it was. Uh, I mean, it was sad in terms of, wow, this really marks the end of an era in terms of now we're not going to see more talks or hear more, uh, new material from her. And, uh, and but I had no real idea about what this meant in terms of, what was to come with, in terms of how Peikoff was going to move forward. But it was clear at that point that he was going to carry on uh, her legacy and impact the best he could. And so, um, but that was around the time where I I was just getting more involved just with my own work career and so I wasn't really following closely the development of ARI and some of those early days and as much as I think I would have really liked to have attended some of those Thomas Jefferson Institute type sessions. As I recall, those are pretty long sessions, 2 week or 3 week long.
Yeah.
It was like camps, and I just didn't have um, the time to orchestrate my life around that. As much as I think it would have been really interesting stuff, material.
Yeah. Yeah. So just as a last comment, let's say, at some point in the future, we'll discuss your book. So as you have in your background, the Municipal Financial Crisis. So we'll definitely post the links to Amazon and so on the YouTube section, the commentary.
Yeah, and my website as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So can you just give us like the version of what the book is about?
Well, it's about how municipalities, local governments get in way over their heads and can never seem to find their way out once they get over their heads in terms of taking on more than they can handle, and how they do that systemically. And I I definitely take a moral perspective on the role of government and what this all means, and uh, try to untangle that. And the bottom line in objectivist terms is you can't successfully administer or budget for an amorphous organization, if an organization that has no identity. And local governments are run as if they have no identity. They make it up from week to week or meeting to meeting, and just invent things as they go, and that's where some of the pragmatism comes out. But I present a positive kind of framework for here's how here's how you can take the scope of activity and get it back under control. Because that's really what's happening is the scope of activity is way out of control, and again that's causing administrative and financial havoc.
Yeah, I mean, in Brazil, we have these kinds of problems as well. So our government isn't exactly what you'd call like efficient or anything positive. So I'm sure, in the Brazilian context, there will be some like a good amount of
And
similarity.
I'll be interested to hear what you have after you take a look at it, because um, because when I wrote it, well, first I was trying to make it so that it was universal enough to work across the United States and not just California, where most of my experience is. And then, of course, Canada is pretty close, and there's a lot of overlap in the way things are done. So I've expanded the vision to U.S. and Canada. But as I'm starting to get set up with social media like Twitter and look at the conversation that's going on Twitter about local government policies, I'm surprised when I find there's a lot of these conversations going on in Europe, or Philippines. I mean, like I will look at like the substance or the content of some of these exchanges about whether it's public sector pensions or kind of the out of control government that can't keep a handle on things financially, and I have to dig in to see, wait a minute, this isn't even the United States or Canada. This is Europe, or other parts of the world that are going through this. So I think it is more universal um,
Yeah,
than what I suspected in terms of the dynamics and the structures that drive these things. Even though the economies may be set up differently and the governments may be structured differently, there's still all the same principles going on in terms of, well, what is the proper scope of your municipality? What should it get itself involved in, and what should it stay away from?
yeah. So that's good. So we'll wrap it up now. I appreciate you coming on as our first guest on this new webinar we're doing, and we'll definitely have you on at some point in the future, maybe a month or two from now, to discuss your book. So, do you have any final thoughts?
No, this has been fun, and appreciate, yeah, anybody who follows the link to my website can get a hold of me, and I appreciate any and all feedback on the book, and anything else from the podcast. So it's been
Yeah,
fun. Thanks.
yeah, thank you. All right, Matheus, I think you can, I think you'll stop recording. That's my guess.